Good morning, everyone. I think I'll lower this a little bit. Can everybody hear me okay? Get off your tippy toes. I'll get my exercise.
One more thing, hold your questions to the very end and we'll answer them then. Sorry.
No problem. So welcome, everybody. How's everybody doing today? It's a nice Wednesday. Hopefully everybody's had a good time at the CUPA conference. So as they explained, this is not an HMBP 101 course. So what I'm going to do is Denise prepared this lovely presentation for me. So I appreciate that. I'm just going to speak a little bit to the processes for the HMBP exemptions. One thing that was really nice, I was going through our CUPA evaluation, is one thing that's real important to recognize is the outreach that CalOES gave Calaveras County. She was able to go through some of our remote site facilities with the assistance of other CUPAs and also myself, and we were able to take some of those facilities offline for the reporting purposes, which gave my percentage numbers at least down to, I believe, 85%. Anyhow, so this course is going to discuss the following. Hazardous materials exemptions in Title 19, Article 2. List of exemptions and the citations will be explained. What this course will not discuss are the hazardous waste issues, tank issues, extensive hazardous material basics, and extensive DOT issues. So for the purposes of a business plan inventory reporting, the term hazardous material is defined in subsection yada yada. I don't want to start stating all the specific numbers. And we're going to be looking at each subdivision individually. So I have to ask this of our lovely staff here and of our attendees. Can anybody give me just a real brief description of what hazardous material means? Anybody? Raise your hands.
Anything that CUPA says it is.
Oh, all right. I like that. So, hazardous material. I mean, we all have a different perspective. We all have our objectives. Our main implementation as CUPAs is to make sure what our priorities are, right? Inspection and enforcement. So these are the basics. Hazardous material means a material listed in yada yada, paragraph 2, because of its quantity, concentration, physical or chemical characteristics, which poses a significant threat to health and the environment, and also to protect the safety of our environment as well. I mean, as regulators and as business owners and operators of CUPA programs, it's real important for us to do that. That's our main tenet. That's why we do what we do. So if those particular materials are released to the environment, maybe our workplace, it puts a priority on a lot of different things, right? Does everybody agree? Raise your hand. So the next slide is going to list and identify some of the hazardous materials, which include the following: a substance or a product for which the manufacturer or producer is required to prepare MSDS. It used to be MSDS. It's now an SDS. A substance listed as a radioactive material. A substance listed pursuant to the Title 49 of the Code of Federal Regulations. A substance listed in Section 339 of Title 8 of the California Code of Regulations. And a material listed as a hazardous waste as defined in the following sections. So HSC, Health and Safety Code 255.
I think you're a slide behind, at least.
Oh, okay.
You just, yeah.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see what's going on here.
Thanks.
There we go. Okay. Okay, thank you. So, I'm on the right slide, right? Hazardous materials include all the following. It's a substance or product for which the manufacturer or producer is required to prepare a safety data sheet. A substance listed as a radioactive material, and a substance listed pursuant to Title 49 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and a substance listed in Section 339 of Title 8 of CCR. And last but not least, a material listed as a hazardous waste as defined by those sections.
So, question.
Yes.
Okay, ask questions now, right?
Yes.
So, on the last slide, B through E are pretty clear. There's a specified list. On A, I mean, distilled water has an STS. So, where does a business or a CUPA find where a manufacturer is required, not does, prepare an STS? Because there are a lot of substances that would not be hazardous materials, yet there still exists an STS for it.
I understand. So the questions, if you don't mind holding that to the end of the presentation, just so we can get through this, that would be great. But that's an excellent question, and that's something that is presented to the CUPAs quite a bit. And then also, if you can come up to the mic when you ask that question, I was just told. Thank you. So the next slide just defines the Health and Safety Code, Section 25501, which is the governing body for a unified program agency, which states that it can adopt specific ordinances that material may not be listed in that specific section. So this is where some of the questions one of the questions that you are asking, or SDS, when it is required. Subparagraph, when a substance or product which the manufacturer or producer is required to produce an SDS is pursuant to the HSCI Training Act. And also, this slide will be available on the CUPA Forum website, and it's also being videoed, so you could get that information. Next, I would like to present Denise Gibson.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, a lot of the things that we're going to go through, we are going to jam-pack this hour and a half, and chances are we probably will be able to answer your questions before you need to ask them. So it might have already been answered. So just hang tight, and what we'll do is we'll allow you to ask questions, come up to the mic, and ask questions at the end. Because it's being videotaped, we're trying to make a squeeze on this one. All right. So this particular course was created because as we went through the evaluations, we noticed that there was a lot of times, at least in my experience, and I know in my colleagues' experience as well, we were explaining to the CUPAs about the remote sites and the ag sites and the exempt sites and blah, blah, blah sites and when and where. And so 2 years ago, I proposed the course, and then, so this is the second year that it's been offered. And basically, having to go through this sometimes on some of the evaluations with certain CUPAs, we wanted to make sure we had the correct numbers, so we would go through this whole entire thing. So I'm really happy that we're able to not only videotape it, but also able to convey this as well, and it gives more information to the CUPAs on how they're going to put, or how they manage their sites. Also, since we were doing it remotely, evaluation, we were depending on SIRS, and some of the SIRS information for inventory and for emergency response and training plans were, must be in SIRS. There are other things like the HMBP inspections that under the statute is that they needed to be at least inspected, but not necessarily always in SIRS. So we were always asking for their database. Sometimes they'd have Envision that maybe didn't get pushed forward, things like that. So there was all these little things going on. So we've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to try and get through this. So if you have any questions, again, at the end, and if we don't have time, we have a whole panel of people that you can talk to. Plus, this is online. All right, so let's get going. So basically, as I was saying, it was during the evaluation that this course was actually born. And so the CUPAs, a lot of times they were doing inspections at remote sites that they didn't know that they didn't have to do that. So we were trying to make life easier, and that's what we were doing. Let me see, there we go. Okay, so Cal OES will evaluate, let me back up. The reason why why I'm up here, and I'm gonna explain to you what we look at, is because we want to let you guys know that this is how we're looking at this, because the numbers were always coming up, and they're like, how do you get that? So, and what we go over. So what you guys put in SIRS, or what even the handlers, the industry puts in SIRS, and the CUPA has to come up and make sure that that's correct, goes into a query, and I'll show you how we do that. And so if your site isn't checked remote, and it's a remote site, then it goes into, okay, well, where's all your inspections for the site, when you really don't have to. So those are things that kind of get, all these numbers and all these data gets a little skewed if it's not put in properly. So that's why I'm going to go through this, and then you're going to hear all the different exemptions and that HMBP has to offer. Okay, so getting back, Cal OES does, as you guys know, looks at the HMBP program, looks at the inventories, whether they're annual due to statute, emergency response and training plans due to statute annual, and the inspections, which are triannual. Okay, so some of this is review, and some of this I'm just trying to catch up. And just, again, this is not a basic class, but we're just trying to breeze through to get you to the point where we can talk about the other stuff. When Cal OES reviews the programs, this is what we want to make sure, I want you guys to make sure that everything is in and everything is complete and correct. It's really hard when you have 20,000 sites, or when you have other sites and you're doing everything else, but that's the only way we know, is we can see it through SIRS until we can get to your site to the CUPA evaluation. We used to go to the CUPA office, and in the last 3 years we've had to do this remotely, trying to figure out ways here. So, anyway, we query everything that's in SIRS, we put it on a spreadsheet, and I'll show you how we do that. And this includes everything. So if you're a fire CUPA and you do under threshold, it gets all thrown in there, unless you tell us a code that you could put. There is a field that you could put a little code that says, like 222, it's under threshold. And then we can pull that code, and then we can delete those from the HMBP numbers. Unless, when we go into this other thing, you want us to, for various different things, you want us to add those for you. But basically, the HMBP program has a threshold, and if you're under threshold, like fire CUPAs will do, then that's all in their SIRS, and we don't want to add those to all the other stuff that HMBP requires. I don't know if that was clear, but it's really hard for me to do this very stand-up straight, because those that know me, I'm usually throwing candy or something, but I'm not doing that today, so I'm sorry. Okay. So again, if they're incorrectly documented, it can cause a lot of havoc with numbers. I've had a few CUPAs, Calaveras being one of them, Lisa had mentioned that. And I know that my cohorts in the back have had this. So we ask, what are your remote sites? We'll do the query. We'll ask for remote sites. We'll ask for the ag exemptions, with Eric will cover. We'll ask for under threshold sites. We'll ask for just, and then again, I talked about the ID number for the under threshold. Okay, so this is what we do. We go to the SIRS, after talking with you and stuff, we go to SIRS, and this is our portal. So this is the regulation portal, and this is what we see. So we put in our number, and then what we do is we do the, and this is what comes up. So then what we hit facilities, and this one's kind of fast, but, and then from there, it has a drop-down tag and goes search. And then we start adding stuff. So what we'll do is we'll put in material inventory, or we could put, I do material just because it's the first one that comes up, always inapplicable. And the thing with the statute is we ask for the ones that are submitted, not the ones that are accepted. The ones that are submitted is in the statute and regs. And basically, if they submit it, then those are the numbers. There's all these different columns. Those are the numbers that we pull your numbers from. Because there's a column that says submitted, accepted, whatever, and I'll show you what we pull. Okay, and then let's say and then at the bottom we'll pull up your county. So, and then from there it'll come up, and everything that's in SERS will come up from your county. Those are including the ones that might have had a facility hold when you had a push through, if you had Envision Connect and it pushed into SERS, and now you have, two different SERS numbers. You have the same company. Maybe there's a company that changed names. It's all there. So this is where we have to go back. When we're done with this, we go back to you and we say, hey, help us here. What is real, kind of thing. So this comes up, and then we export it to an Excel. And what we do is we export it to an Excel for the details. With the details, that gives us everything. Even if we ask for the inventory, it'll give us everything. And how many people have worked with SERS and have worked on this thing and know what I'm talking about? Awesome. There's a lot in here that still don't know, so I'm glad you're here. So this is what we do. So it'll come up, and you can see that there's all these different columns. This is just the start. I mean, there's like, I don't know, 120 different columns. And it has everything in it. It has APSA, it has the business plan, it has UST, DTSC, it has waste, stuff, everything. And the only thing that we really, as Cal OES, there's not a whole lot in there for CalARP, just kind of a thing since we're on this. But we do pull the ERN training plans, we pull the inspections, we pull the business plan information, and we try and pull your CalARP. That's another thing too, this is a little side note, is that make sure your CalARP is CalARP in your SERS, because what will happen is that Mom and Pa Jiffy Lube will think that they're in California, and that, oh, what if they have an accidental release, and they'll punch CalARP. That's a handler, and then it goes to the CUPA that has to confirm that. Well, this SERS queries that for the handler one, just so you know. So you have some interesting things with CalARP. But anyway, so here we are. What we do is we start pulling stuff. So we allow for editing, and then we delete all the columns. Okay, I'm going to do it this way. Delete columns until they have the following list that pertains to segments that, like I had mentioned, for the HMBP. Forget, this is all HMBP, but so here's a list of I've got a full list. Again, this is online, you can look at it on the things that we look at. Mainly, it's the business name, the facility, the SERS ID. We go in and we get rid of the duplicates on the SERS ID, because sometimes you might have that in there twice, so we base it on SERS ID. If we base it on the facility name, you have two different facility names, it may not, but you have two different facilities, but the same name, it may be. So we do a SERS ID, we get rid of the duplicates. Here's another list, and then the list goes on of some of the things, the inventory, the ER, things like that. Okay, so now our spreadsheet looks somewhat like this. So then we can start querying it, because now we have Excel, we can start running some numbers, and what we do is we look at your last date. We always give you 13 months, for the year. And then we check with the CUPA. This is where we send it. We look at it. I'll pull what looks like remote sites. If they all say remote, I'll pull those, or I'll pull, because that's not going to be part of the inspections. But they still have to make sure they have their inventory. And then we'll talk about the ag sites, any dead wood of the facilities. Those are those ones that have that empty chasm at the bottom that has the name and nothing else. And we talked to the CUPA about what all these are. Make sure that there aren't any that aren't that are in there that are under threshold, that are remote, things like that. And then, oh, good. Okay. So, so basically, when we query this, and if you put something that's not right in there, that gets thrown into your numbers. but we'll always check with you. But meanwhile, what will happen is that I really wanted everybody to understand that there's all kinds of exemptions. There's a handler exemption, there's the remote, there's all kinds of things that will affect the program, and just make sure that you have everything checked and all the check boxes are correctly done. I really blew through that, I know. So we're going to have Eric Scott talk about the farm exemptions, and so I'm good to go. And if you have any questions, again, we'll answer those at the very, very end. Thank you.
Good morning again. Here to talk about the farm exemption. Do I have any farmers in the audience? One farmer, nice. There's our pretty farm with their hazmat in the background. So basically, I'm here to talk about the farm exemption, which, as you'll find out, it really isn't all it's cracked up to be. Does anybody use this exemption within their county? You do. Okay. So we do have a few. So basically, if your farm, it's the 255071A says you shall exempt a business operating a farm for the purposes of cultivating the soil or raising or harvesting any ag or horticultural commodity from filing the information in the business plan required by paragraphs 3 and 4 of subdivision A, section 25505, if all the following requirements are met. So they basically have to submit annually to CSRS, which none of mine do. So I have the unique opportunity. My CUPA director is also the ag commissioner. I am in the ag office, and this exemption still doesn't work for me. So I don't use it, or yeah, I don't use it. Huh? Sorry. So basically, they have to submit annually to CSRS. They also then have to post each building and provide notice of storage for any pesticides, petroleum fuels and oil, or any types of fertilizer. Exactly. So they also have to provide training, which we all do. And also within this, basically the Unified Program Agency can designate their county ag commissioner to conduct the inspection for these handlers. Does anybody have any of those agreements within their county with the ag commissioner? You do, okay. Here's a couple of definitions. Ag handler, basically it was referenced as a farm earlier, so it means a business operating a farm. And statewide information management system, we all know what that is, the beast, CSRS. So basically, what did all that mean? It means farmers are exempt from submitting emergency response and training plans to CSRS. Once again, it says shall exempt, not you may, but they still have to meet all the requirements. I'm not going to read through all this. You guys know what training and emergency response plans are. So they're exempt from submitting those, but they're not exempt from training their employees, and they're not exempt from maintaining the emergency response plan. So in reality, they're having to do the plan anyway. There's one more step of submitting to CSRS, which isn't that big a deal, I wouldn't think. And then, once again, back to the warning signs. These are specific signs with what's in the storage area, not just warning hazardous materials, readable from a distance of 25 feet, and visible from any directions of probable approach. So yeah, list the hazmat stored within by category: pesticides, petroleum fuel oils, and fertilizers. So with this exemption is one more. They have to do additional things that a normal business wouldn't have to do. The signs need to be repeated in an appropriate language other than English when it's reasonably anticipated, that persons who do not understand English may enter the building. That is common in my district to have it in Spanish as well. And within these as well as the designation of the County Ag Commissioner to conduct these inspections, which a couple of you do. Within that agreement, it needs to address the inspection, reporting, training, enforcement, and cost recovery requirements to conduct the inspections of the ag handlers. So hopefully the ag personnel that are doing these inspections are trained how they should be to do them. That's really the nuts and bolts of that exemption. If you've, maybe Walmart or BNSF could start planting crops behind them if you want this lovely exemption for you guys. You could put some corn behind the buildings, you know. Oh yeah, cannabis maybe now. Oh, that's not a crop by Fed standards yet, so not a farm, not a farm. All right, so there's some better ways to look for exemptions for a farm. One, the unified, this is the D, the middle on here. Unified Program Agency, upon application by a handler, may exempt the handler under conditions the Unified Program Agency deems proper. We do have an exemption for smaller farms. Basically gives them 3 years to submit. Every 3 years they submit their business plan. Unless there's changes, of course, then they have to. So doesn't get them out of everything else. It just kind of gives them a little leeway there. That helps. In my office, we typically see the farmers every 3 years during their pesticide permits. We are able to sit down with them, get them updated and all that. Another possible exemption you can use, which remote's being talked about? Remote's being talked about later. You could use the remote site exemption for maybe some of their wellheads, their pumps, things like that, if they're properly signed and security on those. So that's all I got, and no questions till the end. So thank you. I don't know who's next. Who's next? Alvin is up next with storage and handling exemptions, transportation and regulatory.
Good morning. I'm Alvin Dong from LA City Fire. I've just been given some bad news. You're not even one half of the way through this presentation. The next part is quite simple. It's the transportation exemptions. And everybody knows what is required for reporting, right? 55 gallons of liquid, 500 pounds of solid, 200 cubic feet of gas. Report it, right? Well, there are some exemptions, transportation being one of them. For transportation, you're not considered storing because storage means it's not in transportation. It's located in 49 CFR if you really want to look for it. The references are in the PowerPoint, which is uploaded on our wonderful CUPA website. So the bottom line, if you are not storing, you are a transportation company, and the terms logistics, freight, shipping, transport, cargo are in your business name, you probably are not required to report any of the materials that are on your vehicles, let alone in your warehouse if you are moving products and goods throughout the region. DOT regulates hazardous materials. We all know that. And DOT has a significant authority to take care of hazardous materials. There are certain entities that required additional safety measures, such as CHP. CHP decided that we wanted to give the truckers a break every 8 hours, because if you're a tired truck driver and you get a little drowsy, you might weave a little, you might end up ending in the next lane. And so the state came up with a a rule requiring that truck drivers be given a 15-minute break every so often. Well, the industry decided it didn't like that idea. And so they petitioned DOT, PHMSA, a preemption request to say, hey, California, we don't like that rule because it interferes with interstate trucking. And PHMSA responded, yes, you're right. And as of September 2018, the California Meal and Rest Break bill was vacated. And if you wanted to really look into that, you can always go into the the Federal Register, an 81 Federal Register 60777, and find that for yourself. I'm told that the notes that I'm speaking about are in the PowerPoint. I just can't see them. Not just California, but also New York. New York Fire Department decided to have an inspection and permit requirement for their hazardous materials. And they basically charged all the trucking firms a fee to transport materials through the city of New York. Truckers got upset, and they decided, oh, that's right, you can't require the fees because you didn't justify them. Number one. Number two, you can't require inspections because it delays transportation. Everybody remember Brexit and what could happen if there's a no Brexit deal at the port cities? A 45-second delay would result in how many days delay in transportation just to get onto the ship? 6 days for a 45-second inspection. So the bottom line is, DOT said, no, you can't do that. Oh, but by the way, for those facilities that are based in the city of New York, you're still subject to the fees because they can't exempt local fees to local businesses. They can only exempt fees for interstate commerce, anything that impinges interstate commerce. The conference had a preemption rule discussion, I believe, on Monday. And the PowerPoint that was presented is quite good. So please review that if you have any questions. Okay, so we go. So we have transportation. Transportation means what? If it goes on a plane, ship, truck, right? If it's on a rail, it's transportation. What is a carrier? No, we don't mean Terry carrier. Oh, I'm sorry, the refrigeration carrier. It's just anybody that moves these materials on a vehicle or aircraft, vessel. And anything that goes on these vehicles are typically carries with them a shipping paper. The shipping paper is just a shipping order, bill of lading, any kind of document, right? It's all up there for you to read. My goal was to just kind of breeze through this, and now I have to stretch because I got to make sure the class lasts till 10:30, 11:30. Otherwise, people get upset at us. And I know that Denise has decided that we'll have lots of questions. So we have the HMBP's statutory exemption for transportation, which is just anything that's under an active shipping paper. The links are there for you to review. Once the transportation vehicle gets to the consignee, which basically means the end of the shipping paper, so once it's delivered to its final destination, as far as the shipper was concerned, so the shipper decides, I'm going to ship it to a warehouse A, and that's my designee. that facility is now subject to reporting requirements. But in between, the shipping location and the shipper is not required to be reportable. So here we go. Material goes from the manufacturer consignee to a port to a logistics area, and then it's divided up, put onto another truck, finally ends up at its final destination. That entire series is not required to be reported as far as hazardous materials. It is all exempted. So we got the truck, we got the vehicles, we got the materials. It doesn't even matter if the materials are broken out. So it can be, it started on one truck and it goes on to 4 trucks to the ultimate destination. Doesn't matter. It's still exempted. Transloading. Hey, we take the material from one vehicle, one container, and we make it into 7 containers, 10 containers. Doesn't matter. As long as the consignee is not an intermediary location. But if you decide to stop and subdivide it, let's say a soda manufacturer, that's a great hazardous material for those of us that are dentists. If the soda is subdivided into separate locations at a destination and it's repackaged and sold off to other people, it can't be held for in an intermediary location. It is now subject to reporting requirements. So here we go. You have the material loaded onto a truck. It gets subdivided to the original consignee. And from that original consignee, he decides that I'm going to decide to subdivide it and I'm going to sell it to individual A, B, C, and D. The manufacturer did not designate the other facilities as its consignee. So that material, that when it gets to that first warehouse, the original consignee warehouse, that material is now reportable. It then loses the reporting requirements once it gets onto the next truck to the final destination. So we have the same thing happening here. We have bulk carrier transferring it to another carrier and then subdivided to different entities. So the bottom line is DOT provides examples of activities which exempt the transportation. As long as your material is stored at the offeror's facility, as long as it's stored on the truck that's going to the final destination, as long as it's actively being transported, it doesn't matter, it's all exempted. Okay? Even rail and motor carriers on a contiguous property can be considered still under active transportation unless it's kind of closed off. So here's a wonderful example of this. We have the rail yard. Material goes onto the rail yard, gets transported into different trains, doesn't matter. We have a production facility surrounded by a fence. Trust me, there's a fence around it. It is not exempted because it's reached its final destination. And if it gets to the warehouse, truck is dislocated or disconnected from the tractor. I'm sorry, the tractor is disconnected from the trailer. That material is basically in effect on the materials, facilities materials, and it's just product being moved around the facility. So it is subject to reporting. So here's your train. Train drops off the material at a rail spur. Rail spurs can be privately owned. They can be owned by the rail company themselves. It just depends whether or not the material has reached its final destination. So if it's not under an active shipping paper, it is subject to reporting. But if it is still under active shipping papers, it is still considered in transport. That subtle designation of under active shipping papers is the key to understanding whether that material is regulated under hazardous materials business plans. Example 2B, same thing. Train drops off in a private rail spur, it's reportable. Truck drops it off at the warehouse, the tractor leaves, the truck stays there. In effect, it's just material being moved around on the property. Repackaging. Repackaging, transloading. Basically, it's just, if the material goes to the consignee's facility, it is now considered a reportable material. If it is not the consignee, but an intermediary warehouse during active transport, exempted. So, in summary, for those of you that have always wondered, what does handle mean? Hey, use, generate, process, do something with the material, right? And a handler is a business that does those activities. And the $64,000 elephant in the room is, what is the hazardous materials? I left it up there. Good luck reading it because I didn't like it, the definition, because as was pointed out earlier, water has a safety data sheet. Is it a hazardous material? No, I'm not that mean. Here's the definitions for you. Storage, if it's there, it's being stored. Handling. 3 additional exemptions exist besides transportation. There's a local governing body, a handler request to an agency, and handler chemical request to an agency. So bottom line is, if a local agency decides that I don't want to regulate a material because I don't think it's that dangerous, the local governing bodies such as LA County, San Diego County, they've all decided that they don't like to regulate carbon dioxide for a restaurant unless it's in a massive volume. They can employ 25507C, which is that a local rule that says you can exempt a certain volume because we don't find it being too hazardous. LA City does not have any of these such exemptions, but LA County does. LA County does not worry about carbon dioxide as long as it is less than 6,000 cubic feet of standard gas, and 3,500 if it's liquefied gas. San Diego County has a similar requirements, except they also don't worry about propane for heating and as long as it's being used for cooking and cooling, up to 1,000 gallons rather than the 500 gallons. That's allowed in the state law. There are 2 other exemptions, which is the agency, the handler saying, can you please exempt me? Good luck with that one. But they're also available to you to petition to your local agency. And the last one is that you can also show the agency that your particular material is not a hazardous material by definition. And so if it is not a hazardous material, you can say, exempt me. There are some procedures allowed for the, required for the facilities, for the agencies to follow if you want to apply for these 3 exemptions. The one is the agency itself. The other one is just for the the local department that regulates you. So the bottom line, if a material is under active shipping paper, it is exempted from reporting. If the material is not under active shipping papers, it is subject to reporting. And there are 3 other exemptions. One's the governing body. You can petition your county, your city, saying, hey, we don't think that this material is that bad. What do you guys think? If they exempt it, like the County of LA, County of San Diego, you can be exempted. And the other 2 are the local exemptions, which is, oh, please, CUPA, we don't want you to inspect us for this material because we don't think it is. We'll show you why it's not. What do you think? And if you have any questions, there's some references for you. And our next speaker is Shruti Sil, who is stepping in for Jeff Holwiger, who's attending to a family crisis. And so we'll move on to Shruti.
Thanks, Alvin. So I'm going to be first covering Jeff's portion before I move on to mine. So Jeff's portion was to talk about remote sites. So let's talk about them. Senate Bill 1261 added a lot of amendments to the Health and Safety Code 6.95. One of them was to clarify the language of remote. The language specified in remote was quite vague, and what it did was talk about remote and said that remote means it's at least 1/2 mile from a nearest occupied structure. So that's the definition that was clarified. Let me give you the good news first. So what is exempt? If you are considered a remote facility, then under the Health and Safety Code, you do not need to report your hazardous material, kind of what Eric talked about in the farm exemption. You do not need to establish and implement a business plan or have any annual submissions due March 1st, which is coming up, and have an inspector come out and inspect your facility. Except there's one little thing that I'll talk about at the end of this. There's one little requirement you need to satisfy. So to get this exemption, what are the conditions your facility needs to meet? It must be unstaffed and located at least 1/2 mile from the nearest occupied structure. The material on site are below the specified threshold. We'll talk about what the specified thresholds are. The facility is secured and it's not accessible to the public. There's warning signs posted and maintained for the hazardous materials pursuant to your California Fire Code or local fire department. So here's a little thing I said, there's one requirement. You do need to submit a one-time modified hazardous material business plan, and it's subject to an inspection. Examples of warning signs, I just put a commonly used ones over here, the propane, the diesel that we find in remote sites, and their NFPA diamonds. The local fire department, LA County Fire, since this was Jeff's presentation, they actually required NFPA placarding for any sites that have NFPA diamond of 3 or higher. So here's an example for one of theirs. They required regardless of the amount of hazardous material stored on site. Okay, so you establish that you have a remote site, then there are the threshold limits. So what are the threshold limits if you have a remote site? So if you have a corrosive liquid, do not exceed 500 pounds. And if you have a combustible liquid, such as a fuel source, like a diesel tank, that's there to power something that is at a remote site, then you can exceed the 500-gallon threshold. If you have lubricating hydraulic liquids, the threshold is, again, 500 gallons, and 1,000 cubic feet for a compressed gas. And if you have a hydrocarbon gas used as a fuel, so for example, propane, the threshold is now 1,200 gallons. And any amount of mineral oil, I'll talk about examples at the end, that are in electrical equipment or transformers, if they're subject to the federal SPCC plan, meaning they have 1,320 gallons of liquid, then that is also exempt. And then I hope you guys know the definition of exempt. That means you do not need to do anything. You're kind of free to go. All right. This is the one-time requirement. So the one-time requirement is that you need to have a hazardous material inventory and site map prepared and reported to SERS. That's the requirement, and also I talked about the warning signs. So you need to have warning signs per your fire department, and the site needs to be secure from the public so that I can't just walk in and maybe siphon some diesel fuel, or while I'm siphoning the diesel fuel, maybe cause a fire. So that's why you need to have that public security. And you do not have to submit the following. You do not have to submit an emergency response plan, and you do not have to have any training documents. The one-time business plan is subject to verification, so there might be fees applicable just for that one time the inspector comes out and takes a look at your facility, does an inspection. There might be some processing fee, the one-time fee. But if there's any changes to your business plan, you need to make sure that it's identified, and there might be additional charges because you made changes to the business plan. The inspector has to still come and verify and make sure that you're still a remote site. You still meet the threshold requirements. You still within the half-mile radius. Okay. I can't finish this talk about remote site without talking about Jeff's story when he was at the Senate bill meeting. So they were discussing, hey, how do we define this half a mile? Well, it wasn't defined. It was just remote, and it was vague. So the discussion was, should we determine remote to be something that's inaccessible, like only a service vehicle can get to this remote site? Or there was discussion if the distance, should it be a mile or a quarter mile? They were talking about all this, and someone was mentioning, like, hey, if I go through a national forest, does that mean it's a remote site? So Jeff, the smarty pants he was, he whipped out the ERG manual, and then they looked at one of the commonly used gases or something that's used at a remote site, which happens to be propane. And when you look at the ERG guide for propane, it's half a mile. So that's how it was established that it was half a mile. Also, I forgot to mention, it was really close to lunchtime, so everyone agreed. And hey, it became law and it became regulation. Okay. The term hangry really does come into play here. All right, so unstaffed facility. So you can always use Google Earth Pro. Hopefully your agency or your business has Google Earth Pro. You can identify the facility, and then, so I've identified this cell tower, and then I identified it through Google Earth Pro, and then I made sure that there's no occupied structure within my remote site. And then zooming out further down, I can see that there's no there's no occupied structure within half a mile. As you can see, the nearest road is from the circumference of my site is about 2 miles away. Common examples, oops, I keep skipping, okay. Common examples, so here's a propane tank. As you can see, the propane tank here was found at a remote site, and it has security around it. It has the warning signs, so it's compliant. So as long as I go out there, I take a look and make sure one time that this is what they have, this is the quantity that they have, this is all good. Propane is most likely used also for like de-icing in remote areas of California, so you might find propane as a fuel source at remote sites. Another common one are cell sites located in remote areas. So you see cell sites have the battery acids. So as long as it's below threshold quantities in the remote site, then it meets the exemption of a remote site. And you just need the one-time business plan. Oops. Next one is the diesel generator. So as long as my diesel generator, the combustible liquid is 500 gallons or less, it meets the threshold requirement, we're good to go. And then transformers. as long as there's an SPCC plan, and the SPCC plan has been prepared for a transformer that's over 1320 gallons, then it's also exempt. Okay, so that's the end of Jeff's. Moving on to my part of the presentation. I'm going to be talking about retail exemption. So before I get into retail exemption, I wanted to talk definitions first so we can get a better understanding of this exemption. So what is a retail establishment before we talk about the stuff that's exempt? Retail establishment means a business that sells consumer product, prepackaged for distribution, intended for use by the general public. A retail establishment does not include a pest control dealer as regulated by the Ag Code. So if you're a retail establishment and you've identified that you're a retail establishment, another question I need to ask myself is, am I handling the product? So Alvin talked about handling a little bit, but I just want to go into the definition again and let you guys know that handling means to use, generate, process, produce, package, treat, store, emit, discharge, or dispose of a hazardous material in any fashion. If you're doing that, then you're considered handling the product, even though you might be retail. Okay, and then my last one that I have, the last one I have here is your retail establishment, and say that you're not handling the product. What you're selling in a retail, are you selling a consumer product? So that's what we're going to figure out. Right? What's going on? Okay, I don't know what happened to the slides. All right, so consumer product. Consumer product is a commodity used for personal, family, or household purposes, or is present in the form and concentration and quantity as a product prepackaged for distribution and for use by the general public. So the intent of a consumer product needs to lie within the retail establishment, and the concentration is another key word here. It needs to be used by the general public. So I have a few examples here. Hydrogen peroxide, 3% that I could buy at my local Target, versus hydrogen peroxide, 64%. And then my other example is 1 gallon mobile hydraulic oil versus my 55-gallon one. So you guys can see the difference, what's exempt, what's not. Yeah, I see a couple of nods, okay. So now that we've established that you're a retail selling consumer product, what does the exemption actually say? So 25507B5 says, a hazardous material contained solely in a consumer product handled at and found in a retail establishment and intended for sale to and for use by the public. If you're doing that, then you're completely exempt. I also wanted to point out these pictures that the retail establishment might have storage areas. So this is a local Home Depot. It might have storage areas that are not accessible to the public. But the intent here is still for me to sell goods to you guys, the public. So that material is exempt. So also, I have a warehouse in the back. I have a storage area in the back of my shop. And if my hazardous material is located in the back, because guess what, I have too much of it, I just had a shipment delivered. If it's in the back and not accessible to the public, my intent again is to sell to the public. So that hazardous material is also exempt. Okay, enough good news. Who is not exempt? Do you make the product? Then you're not exempt. Is it located in a separate warehouse or a distribution center located within your facility? Then you're not exempt. Are you dispensing the product on site? Then you're not exempt. Again, going back to the ag deal, are you a facility that's a pest control dealer? If you are, then you're not exempt. Okay, so here's an example. This is one of the sites I visited, and what it is it's a place that manufactures solvents. So they manufacture solvents, and they do sell to the public, but they have a separate warehouse on the premise that distributes their product throughout the state. The public hours are kind of shady, meaning they're only open like from 3 to 5 to the public. Do you think this facility is exempt? No? Yes? Someone shout it out? No. Yes, it's not exempt. Okay, here's another one. Here's a more common one. Propane, it's a consumer product, but here on site, they also dispense it on site. What do you guys think? Is this one exempt or not? How many of you say exempt? Just one? Okay, how many of you say it's not exempt? Okay, most of you. Oh, we're still awake. I'm glad. All right. So here's a flow chart to just break it down, okay? So I created this flow chart so you can have it. Again, it's uploaded. Start, right? Does your product or material meet any of the following? Is a product located at the manufacturer? Is the product being dispensed on retail premise? Is the product located at a separate warehouse or distribution center? Is the facility a pest control dealer? If you answered yes to all 4, then guess what? You're not exempt. If you answered no to one of them, we'll go to the next slide. Is the hazardous material contained solely in a manner that it's a consumer product? If you say no, it does not meet the exemption. Is the product handled at and found in a retail establishment? If you said no, then the product does not meet the exemption. If you said yes, let's move on to the next one. Is the product intended for sale to and for use by the public? If your answer is yes, then the product meets the retail exemption and does not need to be reported, and you do not need to prepare a hazardous material business plan. If not, the product does not meet the exemption and must be reported on CERS, and you need to make a hazardous material business plan. Okay, so moving on to compressed gases. It's not an exemption, but the threshold is exceeded, so that's why we kind of wanted to talk about this. If a facility handles at one time during the reporting year per Health and Safety Code 6.95, Section 25507A, subsection 5, A, B, and C, what it says is, in a reporting year, if you have a compressed gas that's either a chirogenic or a refrigerant, and for the sole purpose of it being an asphyxiant or pressure release as defined in Title 8 of the OSHA laws, if it's only a pressure release or an asphyxiant, then your threshold goes up to 1,000 cubic feet. I know Alvin mentioned that 200 cubic feet was the threshold for gases, but if you only have a compressed gas, so you see a lot of this at restaurants where you see CO2, they have this chirogenic CO2 that they use for dispensing sodas. Another common gas we see these days is nitrogen, compressed nitrogen, and liquid nitrogen. So if you visit one of those hipster bars, you're probably going to have a nitrogen tank in the back where they're dispensing, beer. Or if you have a creamistery in your area, they're probably using one of these liquid nitrogen tanks. And the threshold is, again, 1,000 cubic feet. Another area where you see the threshold to be 1,000 cubic feet is at a dentist office or a medical office. So the gases that are used here are oxygen, nitrogen, and nitrous oxides. So if you're a dentist office or a hospital or a small clinic that only has very few gases that I just mentioned that are only a hazard because they're an asphyxiant or they're compressed, then your reporting threshold is 1,000 cubic feet. And again, if you're a big building, you might have a fire suppression system, or if you're a building that has a lot of hazardous materials, you want to have your own fire suppression system. The fire suppression gases, if they're above 1,000 cubic feet, have to be reported. I also wanted to mention that for the purpose of this section, because there's usually confusion statewide for compressed gases, if the hazardous material or a mixture of hazardous material is at standard temperature and pressure, it should be reported in the physical state that it's stored. So if you have liquid CO2 and the physical state is in a liquid, then you should report your hazardous material as gallons. So when you're checking, verifying CERS, or when you're reporting in CERS, make sure you're reporting it the right way, so that when Cal OES comes and does their verification, you're all compliant. All right. Let's see if this works. I have a video, but I did embed it. Okay. Anyways, it's just an example of a guy using a plasma cutter, and what I wanted to show is he's using a plasma cutter, and when he's cutting, he's using a combination of nitrogen and hydrogen gases. So hydrogen is a flammable gas, even though nitrogen is not a flammable gas. He's using a mixture of those two gases to do the cutting process itself. So then the threshold goes back down to 200 cubic feet. And then he takes a piece of weld, and then he actually welds it on another piece onto that cut that he made. And at this time, he's using a tag weld, and in that, he's using argon and CO2 gases. So when he's using inert gases, such as argon and CO2, even though they're a mixture of two gases, the threshold is still 1,000 cubic feet. That's what I was trying to explain in this example. And of course, if you have questions about compressed gases, we'll talk about it at the end. Okay. I got it. Okay, so this picture provides a great segue to our talk about subsection B. So this is a picture of my husband buying a drink at Whole Foods. So who can tell me what gases you see here and what's exempt and what's not? So there's two gases, I'll give you a hint. One is in the refrigerated section, and one is up top. You see the piping on top, the HVAC unit. Which one's exempt and which one's not? Anyone raise your hand?
The one in the fridge. The one in the fridge is exempt.
The one in the fridge is exempt? It's not, okay. What about comfort cooling? What about the store itself? What about the HVAC unit? What do you guys think that is? Exempt? Everyone agrees? Yes, that's true. So, because the items that are stored in the refrigerated sections are for profit, even though it's in the same store, in the same area, those need to be reported, but the comfort cooling item is not reportable because it's comfort cooling. Okay, I'll give you a few more examples. So this is a Verizon hub. As you can see here, can you guys tell what's exempt and what's not? So I'm gonna ask you, there's battery acid, and then there's the HVAC unit. What do you think the battery acid is? Is it exempt or not? No, the battery acid's not exempt. Oh, I forgot to tell you, it's not a remote site, okay. And then the HVAC unit here is exempt, right? Because it's used for comfort cooling, or the other exemption is if it's used in computer rooms. So that's where that exemption kicks in. Okay, and here's a picture of our OC hazmat guys getting geared up to go check out some unknown situation. So what do you think? The gases, the compressed gases that they're using in the back of... Exempt? Yeah. There's no quantity again for these exemptions. Okay, Alvin talked about it a little bit, but I'm gonna touch on it also. So under Health and Safety Code 6.95, section 2557B, propane, if it's used for storage, for cooking, for employee work areas, you can have up to 500 gallons, and it's exempt. But if you're using it for profit, meaning you're using it to heat up an area outside for your patrons, for people that are coming to eat at your restaurant, then now you have to report it. And also, someone from the fire department wanted me to throw this out here, is if you're storing propane inside your restaurant, there might be some fire department issues. Their threshold is actually close to 50 gallons, at least here in Brea and Fullerton. So 500 gallons might not apply. So you also need to check with your local fire department for their exemptions, just like Alvin talked about. And that's it. Questions? Yeah, if you can, or she will bring out the mic. Oh, very nice. Should I stay here? Just take the mic.
I had a question for Alvin about the storage and handling. Could you maybe speak a little bit to if the applicability of 30 days comes in at all with when you, I know you're talking about kind of the life cycle of transportation in that if the material's still on the paper, you're exempt until it gets to its final route, and there could be some stops along the way where you said where a business might have to report, but does the 30 days come into effect of it being on site, or are you kind of looking at an overall, like throughout the calendar year if this process is happening?
As long as the material is under active shipping papers, there is no time limit. So it can be on that side of the road, on a truck, 1 day, 10 days, 1 month, 2 months. It's under active shipping papers, no reporting is required. You can create your own shipping paper, yes. However, you are now subject to DOT transportation requirements, which provides for security and management. So there's really no easy way. You either pay Paul or pay me.
Could you give a definition for occupiable structure for remote sites?
Normally occupied structure. You want to do it? A normally occupied structure means that somebody's actually there during a workday. If nobody's there, it's unoccupied. A typical unoccupied structure is a cell phone repeater. Nobody's there unless they're doing maintenance work. They're not scheduled to be there every single day. They're not scheduled to be there routinely. Question over here.
When you first started talking about going through the list and taking facilities off of there, if they're remote, or not remote, if they don't meet the criteria. For example, I have a client that has many facilities that are remote. They're generator sites, they're under 500 gallons diesel. So are you going to be going through that system and going, oh, they don't need to be reported under that now? Or is that something we need to do?
Okay, what, you want to answer?
Okay. Those facilities that are remote still have to report one time.
Right, okay.
Okay, so that has to be clear. After that, it's up to you and your client to notify the jurisdiction that, hey, this is a remote facility and we're
No more.
using this exemption.
Okay. So it's not anything you guys are going to go through the list and start taking things off?
No, you can't
Okay.
take things off.
All
It
right.
stays in CERS.
Okay.
It's just that they, as far as inspection, they could go up and do an initial inspection, but then that's not on the inspection thing. But just to be sure that they don't add anything, maybe have their inventory updated every year.
So follow up to your question. Ooh, I'm loud. Maybe I don't need this. So if we already have a facility in CERS, we now realize we're subject to this exemption. You want us to go ahead and reach out to our local CUPA, make a notification, and then submit the modification?
Yeah.
Okay.
Please do, because otherwise nobody will know.
Yeah. If in doubt, just talk to your CUPA.
And it's a win-win for both of us. You don't have to pay any fees, and you don't have to come out of it.
One of the other things too, For exemptions, remote, is if you're we're in Orange County, we're in LA, and but some of the northeast areas of California have rail lines that get snow on it, so they have propane tanks on their rail lines. And for CUPA, they were wondering, gosh, is that going to be remote? But it is. That would be considered a remote site. And then it has certain things, like for something like that, they want a fence around it, some signs. But that would be a remote situation. Because the tank is there just for de-icing those rail lines. So anybody at BNSF or UP? No one? Okay. Okay. Oh, hang on a second. She's bringing you the mic.
So they are considered remote, right?
Yeah.
Those propane tanks?
The propane tanks on the rail lines that are, half a mile from any receptor, yeah, it's still under the same thing, but a lot of times there's all these propane tanks that are used for de-icing, and they would be considered remote. What county are you in?
San Bernardino.
Okay. Yeah, you have a few there. You have to have those fences around them.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
I know, they're in these canyons in San Bernardino, but if somebody got into it, you just want to let the BNSF know that, I think it's BNSF that's going through you guys, that they should protect their tanks, basically. I know I went through that, what we did on the matrix fairly fast. A lot of things that I didn't even talk about was in the beginning where there's like the editing, it says up on top, and then the first two lines. And that's so you can easily query those numbers as well. If anybody had any questions about that one, because I know I really went through that fast. All right, you guys are all good. Any other questions? Great. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. You had given an example about the propane using outdoor heaters, and you're saying that that's reportable because it's not an employee work area. What about the waiters and waitresses and bus people that go out into those outdoor areas in order to work and perform work? Would that not be also considered a work area, and therefore those propane containers that are out there for those heaters would not need to be reported if they're below the threshold?
Okay, so I'm gonna look at the big picture. Why are the waiters going outside? To serve the customers.
They're working though, right?
Yes, but they're going outside. The main purpose of them to go outside is to serve the customer. And the reason why the propane tanks are there is to provide a better service for your customer. If you were sitting inside, I would still come serve you, right?
Right, but I'm just, we have looked at that as being something that we, would not report because we would consider that to be a work area for people who are working at the restaurant, and so therefore it's exempt. And so your interpretation of that is different. So I'm just curious, is that something that's defined somewhere, or is that just an interpretation that you've
It's an
you've chosen?
interpretation, and
Okay.
it's also through the hazmat tag. If you attend, I see you're a regulator. So if you attend the tag or look at the discussion board, you can see that's what we've interpreted. If it's for profit, then the propane does need to be reported if it's over 55 gallons.
Okay, all right, okay. And the other one is for mixtures of like gases, calibration gases, like nitrogen, and you have like greater than 99% nitrogen, and you got less than 1% methane, or some other flammable, gas or what have you. Those mixtures, do the exemptions still stay at 1,000 for nitrogen because the concentration of the gas that's not flammable is so small, it's less than 1%, or does it lose its exemption and go down to 200 cubic feet because of a small but definite concentration of a gas that's not flammable?
So this goes back to the original definition of hazardous material. So if you have a hazardous material and you have a safety data sheet, if you look at the mixture gas, you're talking about 99% nitrogen and 1% methane, the safety data sheet is probably going to say flammable. If it has a hazard characteristic other than an asphyxiant or pressure release, then yes, it goes back down to 200 cubic feet.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
Did I hear you correct say that in Fullerton you could have 50 gallons of propane stored indoors?
It's up to your local fire department. It's a fire code requirement. So
Right.
even though health and safety code says 500 gallons, there might be local fire department requirements that are more stringent than my 500 gallon requirement.
Right, okay, thank you.
Okay. I'm gonna kick.
I think just another comment, I've gone over that debate a lot with you as well, and I think a lot of the, the propane storage too was also, it gets highlighted by more with agencies that are either usually that are fire departments and working with fire code. I think another way, sometimes I think the term like, for sale or for profit, maybe also looking at the overall intent of the hazmat program, the business emergency plan is to, make the public aware of emergency situations, and having an emergency plan in place for how to deal with those situations. So, no different than having a CO2 release in a restaurant and you have an evacuation, you should have a plan in place to notify, the patrons to get out of the restaurant and just, to have the employees overall aware of what their emergency action plan is. I think you could argue the same, having patrons eating around propanes in a restaurant setting. It's just, it's at that point you have the public exposed to a hazard right next to them, and, having that awareness and the emergency plan in place. I mean, I think that's not a, tough argument too. So just, I guess maybe some of my own mental justification getting to that point, because there's been it seems like you can almost define that space, either way. So anyway.
Great. Any other questions? All right. Gift of time. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.